Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to be together to talk about such an important topic. We have some wonderful sponsors today. My friend Heather Peeler is here from Act for Alexandria. They're one of our sponsors. Carter Eccles and the LCD Eccles Charitable Trust is one of our sponsors, and then our fantastic partners at the Kresge Foundation. Kresge supported this event. They also supported and underwrote the administrative part of our pilot so that the local dollars here all went out to families who needed it. Yeah, thank you. We also have a number of elected officials here or on their way from Arlington, but also from pilots around the country, or around the region. DC, Alexandria, Prince George's County, Montgomery County, our state senator, our local NOVA delegates, representatives from Senator Kane's and Warner's offices, and then Congressman Byers' office as well. So thanks to them for joining the conversation. When I look around this room, I see a whole lot of people that have a lot of power and interest to do something about a really important topic. We have our frontline workers, we have funders, large and small, institutional and personal. We have a number of people from pilots around the region. I was talking to a gentleman, Darrick, from the city of Richmond, made it all the way up from Richmond. First one here too, I will say. Planning for some traffic. And engaged community members all, we're all here eager to learn and to figure out what we can do next. When I was thinking about today, the first thing I wrote was, this is a culmination of our pilot, which is such a small way to think about our pilot, right? Because we get into the day-to-day of getting the day-to-day things done in a guaranteed income pilot, getting those families enrolled, getting the money on the way to them, and checking in with them along the way. But what this is really the start, not the end. And culmination, I think, makes me think that something is ending and the hard work is really beginning now. And that's why we're so grateful to have this conversation as that next step. We are proving concept, right? And then we have to move on to policy change. And policy change is the only real way to move this work forward. We joined this movement with our friends from Arlington County, and I see a number of them in the room today, in 2020, I'm so old. And when we started this work, there was a pandemic, right? I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room it was a difficult time, but what we saw was an acceleration of people's understanding and interest in seeing what direct cash in the hands of people who need it could do for them. And so what we know and learned during the pandemic is something that many people who I look around this room and see have known for a long time, and which makes logical sense, right? Providing cash with no strings attached is absolutely essential to giving families the breathing room that they need to be able to work on their aspirations for their families and to care for their loved ones. It's not rocket science, but it's not the way policy works now. Public benefits alone are not the answer. Our pilot is public benefits protected because there's no amount of cash in any of these cash pilots that can fully replace what our public benefits system does for people. But we know that system and the wage structure is not working for many people in our country and in our community especially. Guaranteed income is a way to rebalance our economy that disproportionately works for the wealthy and powerful. Disproportionately works for the wealthy and powerful. Arlington's Guarantee is a fully privately funded pilot that the Arlington Community Foundation embarked on in 2021. We have 200 families in this community that are getting $500 a month for 18 months, the last of which will finish that 18 months later this fall. Thank you to all in this room especially and all over our community who contributed to this. It's been really important that we had the private funding from so many of you because that was one of the key pieces that allowed us to have flexibility in both our design and our implementation. When you keep government out of the process, you have that flexibility, but only in the pilot phase. What we're going to be talking about today is how when government gets involved, it can do so in a productive way. We also want to thank the 200 families that came along on this journey. They received this funding as part of the pilot, which met to a person they felt very blessed to receive. But they are giving something back in return, which is the benefit of all of us getting to learn what that money does for them, how it gives them slack and gives them breathing room. And that's been exceptionally important. We're just so grateful that they came along on this ride with us. And then I want to also thank our incredible staff, led by the peerless and passionate Ann Vorderbrugge. It was too late to spring it on her, but I thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe she's having me stand up here instead of her, because she would be doing such a much better job at this than I do. Because it really, what she knows is that it takes a village to do all of this work, and Anne always brings people along for the ride, and many of you are people that have personally engaged with her on this work and so many other things. But there's also Sorelli and Eric and Brian and Christy and Nick and Jamie and Natalia and so many more on our team and around this community making this work move. So it's exciting to be in the room together, to grow together. There's people in this room who know a lot about guaranteed income, and some of you are here just to learn. I fall somewhere in the middle of that, where I feel like I know a lot, and then I read something else and feel like I don't know anything at all. So I think as we come together that we're all learning about either this concept or we're ready to kind of take that next step. And it's just an honor for me personally and for the Community Foundation to be a part of helping this community take that next step together. So the next step, right? What is it? We need to bring to the stage our distinguished speakers. I'm going to introduce now. We have Nisha Patel, who's our moderator for today. She's a national expert on social and economic mobility. She's the former director of the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, and which works on promising interventions to make real, lasting progress against persistent poverty in our country. And her work has been influential, and her concepts and her language have infiltrated all of what we do at the Arlington Community Foundation and many, many organizations beyond the Community Foundation. So welcome, Nisha. She is joined today by Dr. Darrick Hamilton, who has a lengthy list of awards and recognitions for his groundbreaking work. Many of you are super fans of Dr. Hamilton, which we heard when we put out the announcement about this. And he really, we are trying to amplify the heart of what Dr. Hamilton speaks about. It's very simple, but it can be exceptionally hard, I think, in practice to figure out how to bring this to fruition. But his work is centered on the idea that your human existence should entitle you to a sense of belonging and deservedness. And that sounds so simple, right? No one on its face would argue with that, but here we are. And given our tendencies for division that we see today, we have to affirmatively look for an inclusive way to move forward. So that all sounds very heartstrings, and it's about the heart of the work, but we are fortunate that he's an accomplished professor and economist. So in addition to having the heart for this work, he also knows how to design very practical financial solutions and policy interventions that can create an economy that works for everyone and anyone. So without further ado, I will turn it over to the experts. Thank you all.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I know it's a beautiful day outside, but we're gonna have so much fun in here. You ready to have fun? Anytime I get to share the stage with Darrick is a good time. So what I wanna do first is actually ground today's conversation by kicking off with a couple of really important definitions, just to get us all on the same page. And the first definition I wanna talk about is mobility. What do we mean by mobility? And then second, guaranteed income. Let's just get all on the same page about what we mean by that. So it really warms my heart that the Arlington Community Foundation uses a definition of mobility that I was privileged to help develop. I'm really humbled by that. And it was adopted from a body of work that I was proud to lead 5 years ago at the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty. And we developed this definition. We certainly talked to a bunch of economists, folks like Darrick, and kind of experts in the research and the data, but we spent a bunch of time going around the country to 30 different urban, rural, suburban, tribal communities, and actually breaking bread, talking with people experiencing poverty, compensating them for their time, taking all of that feedback in to understand what do we mean by upward mobility. And we came up with 3 components. And the first, I think, will sound familiar to all of you, and that is this idea of economic success, increasing your income, your assets, your wealth. And that, most people get that. That's typically how we measure poverty in the US. But one really, really important insight that came out of that work was this idea that poverty is not just about a lack of money. It's much more than that. It's also about a lack of power. So we added a second component, which is this idea of having power and autonomy, having agency over your own life, having a say in what happens in the trajectory of your community. We said, that's also not enough. Yes, it's about money. Yes, it's about power, but it's also about being valued in your community. And what we mean by that is really having a sense of belonging, having access to social capital, to networks, to connections that can help you on your way up the ladder. The second definition is guaranteed income. And what I love about guaranteed income, so many things, let me count the ways I love guaranteed income, but what I love about it is that it embodies all 3 of those components that I just mentioned. Guaranteed income, what are we talking about? We're talking about a regular cash payment, often it's monthly, but it doesn't have to be, that's accessible to very specific targeted members of a community with no strings attached. It's unconditional, no other requirements, right? That's where you get agency. People know best what they need and how to deploy resources. And guaranteed income redistributes money to people who need it most and who are facing that lack of access to opportunity, to mobility. And I want to put a kind of a fine point on this. It's different from this idea you might hear a lot about in the media, UBI, or universal basic income. And sometimes people use those words interchangeably, but I want to be really specific. We're not talking about universal. Because if something is universal, it goes to everyone, right? Everyone in this room, Darrick and I, who are both gainfully employed, would get access to it. I don't think we need it. Yeah. Billionaires would get access to it. I really don't think they need it. So we're not talking about universal. We're talking about building a floor, an income floor, under which no one in this community, no one in this country would fall. And it's intended to complement, not replace existing public benefits. It's not saying do away with other safety nets and things that we have to ensure a fair and just society. It's saying let's complement the existing structure. And it's based on 2 or 3 really important principles. It's based on trust, it's based on respect for the folks that receive it, and it has a focus on freedom of choice and, again, agency. So I can't say that enough, so why don't you just ground the conversation in that? All right, so that's all for me. You ready to hear from Darrick? All right, here we go. So Darrick, you have been a champion of a framework that I've heard you say this many times, this idea of inclusive economic rights. And I'm wondering if you can share with the audience a little bit about that overall overarching framework, because I know you got a lot of good ideas, and guaranteed income is just one. So share a bit about the framework, and then tell us how guaranteed income fits into that framework.
And I'm going to begin with gratitude. First, grateful for you. I love being on stage with you. We've kind of done this dog and pony show before, and I think you'll be in for a treat. And grateful for Ann and Jen and all of you being here in the room, the whole Arlington Community Foundation network, and everyone else who's not affiliated with it. So, inclusive economic rights. Why do you need the word inclusive? Isn't it kind of redundant if you say something is a right to add the word inclusive? Well, the inclusive part comes about from history. In the past, we've done programs that have promoted economic rights. Social Security was an economic right to age-old pension, and arguably our best fiscal policy, one of the most long-lasting fiscal policies we've ever passed. We got tired of the immoral blight of watching our elderly in poverty struggling, and we passed Social Security. Well, at the time, it excluded domestic and agricultural workers. And domestic and agricultural workers, we knew that black women engaged in employment, 90% of them worked in one of those fields. For black men, it was over half. So that wasn't simply a coincidence. That was a design issue. That was a design issue that excluded certain segments of the population. If we even look beyond Social Security, hopefully we have reached the point in American society where we can recognize that we have a sordid history. We have a history that exploited and extracted based on things as cursory as identity, whether it was race, gender, etc. So, and this information isn't necessarily intended to shame, but rather to learn. So if we want to learn from the past and think about an economic rights framework, a necessary ingredient is that we design it, we implement it, and we manage it in ways that are intentionally inclusive. A word that we can use is intentionally anti-racist. So these policies fulfill rights to everyone, but they also recognize that our structure is not race neutral. It's naive to think that anything in America is race neutral. We have a built-up apparatus. Indeed, policy itself is not some exogenous, determined approach to address an issue that's devoid of a history and understanding and built-up relationships. So we're sophisticated. We recognize that we have this structure that's been built up, and if we want to chart a new course, a better course, then we have to be intentional in how we do that course.
Okay, so we're talking about structural issues, and I think that's important to lift up because you can hear guaranteed income going to individual people and think that, oh, it's a one-by-one strategy. And we're gonna get into policy a little bit later, but we're thinking big here. We're thinking way beyond pilots in Arlington. So speaking of which, the pilot in Arlington, Arlington's Guarantee, and many others around the country are funded by philanthropy. And they're changing assumptions, they're changing narratives about people's desire to work and need for agency. And that's great. Philanthropy has been a huge champion and supporter of this work. A lot of folks that are in this room that have supported this work. But we know to take this to scale, we need government resources. We need government resources if the idea is to make this widespread policy. And Darrick, one of the proposals that you've put forward leverages the federal tax code. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about this idea that you have for a national guaranteed income that would leverage the tax code. Tell us about what it is, how would it work?
Yeah, and 2 quick points. One, I love the title of this event, right? It didn't start with the case for guaranteed income. It started with building a human rights economy. And why I love it is that there's a North Star. There is a direction that we're trying to get to. There is a conception of freedom. There's a conception of the way the world should exist, the way our country should exist. We don't start in that position enough. I'm an economist. I teach economic classes. We don't ask the question at the beginning of our class, what is the purpose of an economy? So if we lead with that one question, what is the purpose of government? How do we want our economy to look like? What better way to end up than a human rights economy? One that facilitates people to be people, to live their essence, to be self-determining in righteous ways, to have capabilities, to contribute productively to our society, right? So that's the North Star. That's a conception of freedom that I think we have. Our ideas about freedom, our ideas about justice have been co-opted a little bit over the years. We have gone to the point where we believe that people should have rights to vote, right to civil organization, right to be free from the tyranny of government. And those all are important. Those all are critical. But they're incomplete, inadequate, and dare I say, co-opting without another fundamental right that's necessary in that domain, and that's economic rights. Because if you're hungry, telling somebody you're free because you can vote, well, that's not honest. If you're not housed and telling somebody, well, you can go and have freedom of speech and you're free, well, that's not honest. So guaranteed income is a fulfillment of a critical element of a human rights economy, which includes civil, political, social, cultural rights. Those all are important. But if you don't have that economic rights component, I dare say not only is it inadequate, it's a co-optation. It's a co-optation that absolves our public of responsibility, because the onus of inequality, the onus of mobility is put on the individual without recognition of structures. So to answer the question, and that long-winded answer, so I apologize, is government has a fiduciary responsibility to its people to facilitate economic inclusion, civic engagement, social equity. And government, the federal government in particular, because of the sovereign monetary power that the federal government has, is that ultimate North Star to achieve a human rights economy and do things like guaranteed income, right? Not simply because we believe guaranteed income is useful in a charitable sense, in a sense to promote the charitable consumption of people, but rather really to facilitate their capabilities, to facilitate the ability to, if I live in the suburbs and the jobs are in the city, to get a car so I can get to the city. If I live in the suburbs and my job is the night shift and my child is out of school, to facilitate the capabilities to hire childcare so that you can get to the job, right? So ultimately, we don't have to wait on the federal government because we know how policy works. It starts at local levels, it builds up, and very well, there are things we can do with our somewhat limited resources at the local and state level as well, where we don't have to wait on the federal government. But ultimately, that's what we should be striving for, a human rights economy. And the federal government, particularly the United States federal government, certainly in the 21st century has the resources and the capabilities to fulfill that.
And how would that work, Darrick? I mean, I think many folks are familiar from the last few years. Like a lot of folks in this room probably got economic impact payments. You got a check or a direct deposit from the Treasury, from the IRS. A lot of folks that have kids got child tax credit. Some folks got monthly payments. So is it along those lines? I think if people didn't know before, we now know that the U.S. government actually has the capability to very quickly send almost every American money fast. Don't need Venmo to do that, right?
That's right. Right. And Jen brought this up in the beginning also, right? We've seen these guaranteed income demonstrations throughout the country, and no doubt it makes a difference in people's lives. We see that as well. But now we need policy. Now we need to get it implemented in a sustainable way. Well, why not the tax code? Why not use our biggest fiscal tool, the U.S. tax code? And by the way, the tax code is more than revenue collection. The tax code is the mechanism by which government, it's our most potent weapon, our most potent tool by which government strategically directs resources to promote economic dynamism and economic activity. So well beyond revenue collection, we make decisions about who we're going to tax more, labor or those that own a business, right? The different ways in which we tax labor income versus capital gains is a value. And not only is it a value, it's a strategic direction of resources. And as Nisha so aptly pointed out, we've also seen that the IRS can direct money to the American people in a very efficient way. There were some bumps as we went through a lot of the stimulus during the pandemic, but in reality, if we didn't do what we did, we would have went into a Great Depression. Billions of dollars went to the American people in a non-stigmatizing way. People didn't have to go to an office and potentially be humiliated. There was some automatic way in which they were able to receive resources. And let me say this other part. It's another horrible narrative. Taxpayers' money. And you know why it's a horrible narrative? Because the implication is that these people are deserving and these other people are not. Technically, it's not taxpayers' money. technically it is U.S. government money. It is public money. Now, we use it as a store, we use it as a medium by which we store our wealth and store our income, but technically that money doesn't belong to individuals, it belongs to the public. But what's more, it's a demeaning narrative because the tax code should not benefit only certain segments of the population, it should be democratized. So we can do guaranteed income by way of the tax code. Have people heard of the earned income tax credit? Right? So the earned income tax credit is our biggest anti-poverty program, but it has conditions to it. It has the condition of working. It says that in order to receive this benefit, you have to work. I can go on and on and on, and I got to be careful because this is a dialogue, so interrupt me at any point, Nisha. And we could talk about the debt ceiling and some of the narratives that came about from that deal also when we get into this conversation. But the point is that what if instead of having the work requirement, you relax the work requirement and you literally shift the earned income tax credit to not start at zero and require people to work, but shift it up to the poverty level. Literally eliminate poverty. Poverty is a political choice. We have enough resources to eliminate it. So you could lift the earned income tax credit up to some threshold above the poverty line so that nobody lives in poverty, still keep it so you still have a negative income tax, and then stretch it. There's no reason that we have to limit it to an anti-poverty program. We can promote more people getting into middle-income lifestyles. I know we're right here in Alexandria, Virginia.
We're in Arlington.
Sorry. Ooh.
You're close, though.
And I'm really talking too much. So my point was
He's
going to
from
be...
New York. Please forgive him, center of the universe.
The cost of living is such that we need to do more than anti-poverty. A program where we use the tax code to promote guaranteed income, we've seen that we can do it. The IRS has already broken that precedent to show that they can send money directly to I was about to say American taxpayers, to the public. But we can also structure that policy in a way that promotes more people getting into middle income lifestyles by offering income in a way to them, again, graduated, so that they also are steering towards more income style life.
So Darrick, since you hit on work requirements, and I think if we have a chance, we'll get into the debt ceiling, since that's literally the issue of the day around the country. But I want to kind of dig in on the work piece and then maybe pull up and talk about some of the other evidence we have. There are now over 100 guaranteed income pilots. Arlington's is one, but there are pilots all around the country. But there's a particular finding related to work that I think may surprise some folks in this room, and that is the finding that cash with no strings attached actually encourages work. Yeah. So let me say that again. Basically, it sounds counterintuitive, I think, but if you give people free money, they work more. If you give people free money, they work more or get better jobs. So I'm wondering if you can just kind of turn the key on that, dig into that a little bit, and maybe talk about some of the specific research, because it might sound unbelievable to people.
Yeah. So Nisha pointed out the overwhelming empirical evidence that has stood the test of time and also goes across space. The counterintuitive notion that offering people income increases work is indeed an empirical finding. Now, I imagine that there's some level of income by which it probably would lead to diminished work hours, but that's not what we're talking about here in this room. In fact, that's probably a counter-argument against universal basic income. But for the population that we're talking about, it actually improves the likelihood of working. And why? So the question is why? Again, what is our most potent resource in America or the world? People, right? I believe that people are the engine of our economy, the ingenuity of people, the desire of people. And how do you facilitate that? Well, with some resources. If you don't offer resources to facilitate that asset, then those people are subject to two things: somebody's charitable inkling, or they're vulnerable to exploitation. There's no choice, right? There's no ingenuity in that case. But if you offer people resources, not only does it enable greater work, but it also shifts power, right? So that's a word we should use a lot more when we have these discussions. Because power does two things. One, we value power as an outcome. Who doesn't want to be self-determining? Who does not want to have agency in their lives? But power is also an element as an input, right? More so than just as an output. The ability to do things can generate outcomes in and of itself. So what guaranteed income can do, it becomes a resource that empowers people, not just an outcome, but enables them to do things and also negotiate better terms for themselves, right? So again, I'll be quick in this last point. I'm a university professor. I've been privileged with the benefit of tenure. So I can come to a stage and speak more freely than if I was threatened by loss of job. So I can negotiate better with my deans. That threat of unemployment has been removed from me. So we want to enable people with some resources so that they're not stuck in that threat of unemployment where they really don't have agency in their lives. They can negotiate on at least some decent terms.
I wonder if there's more, you've talked about this already, you've touched on it, Darrick, but this idea of having a good job. You know, I have a lot of friends that are economists, and as we think about AI and everything else, I think, and I'm curious where you are on this little bit side note, but like, there's not going to be a shortage of jobs. There never has been as technology evolves. What there ends up being is a shortage of good jobs. And so I'm wondering about what the intersection is with a good job and guaranteed income.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in there. Right now, we look in the media, you're hearing news around not only the debt ceiling, but historically low unemployment numbers. And they often talk about black people having historically low unemployment numbers. Well,
but there's still 2x white people, right?
Close to it, right? They're still, right, and that's the other point, right? So jobs are historically low for everyone, right? But we want to single out the black group and spike the football and say racism is over, discrimination is over. So don't be premature. The criteria shouldn't be a job, it should be a good job, right? Indeed, a job could be associated with a dystopia, right? We want 21st century jobs that facilitate people to be their best selves with dignity, with decent wages, with some autonomy in those jobs. So I agree that we need to think about good jobs as the criteria, not just a job, and certainly guaranteed income is the mechanism. So you also asked the question in there about technology. So we've seen this before. There was the Industrial Revolution, and there was fear in the Industrial Revolution. You know, we were largely an agrarian. What's that? Agrarian society.
We were farmers.
Yep, we were farmers. And there was fear that as we mechanized, that it was going to lead to loss of family values, loss of jobs, and many jobs were displaced. But over time, new jobs came, and we had a different type of an economy. But in that transition, there was a lot of exploitation. There was a lot of extrapolation. So, you know, Nisha you were kind of needling me. What do I think? Are the robots going to take over? Certainly, certain jobs are going to be lost, but new jobs will emerge that I can't foresee right now. Now, it is true that the rate of job displacement and the rate of technological change is unprecedented. But I dare say that we have, as a society, choice in managing an economy to, one, mitigate some of the harm that might be done to displacement of certain jobs, but also ensure that we are directing people to jobs that we still need. For example, we have this environmental crisis that's going on. We could literally green our entire economy by offering jobs in that area to green our economy, for which the robots clearly aren't doing that right now.
And maybe, would you add care work? I would, as another one.
Oh, absolutely. Care work, right? Do you want a robot caring for your elder or your child? Probably not. I mean, and this is important work that we can invest in and productive work, right? This is not, again, not charitable. This is perhaps one of the most important things that we can do, because everybody in this room is going to need care at some point.
Yeah, right. Fully agree. I mean, I just want to say, to quote my friend Ai-jen Poo, care work is the work that makes all their work possible, right? Like, how many of you would be here today if you didn't have childcare, if you didn't have elder care, if folks in your family who may have disabilities didn't have care? Probably none of us could be sitting here today. So just thought I'd get that in while I have the mic.
Yep.
But I want to pull up from the work piece, because not everybody in this room works on jobs and workforce, right? I bet there are folks in this room who work on housing or food issues, mental health issues. And I wanted to lift up some of the other findings from the pilots around the country. So yes, work is important. But what's really interesting is when we look at the data from these 100+ pilots around the country, we see some amazing results. We see increased housing stability. We see reduced food insecurity, improved physical and mental health, more folks having cash for emergencies to stop people from spiraling into a crisis, right? You've got the money to fix your car when it breaks down. You've got the money to pay for medicine when you get sick. More people pursuing education and training to improve their job skills. Reduced debt. Stress reduction that improves parenting and family outcomes. So that touches on so many issues that I know folks in this room are working on. And I mean, there's no such thing as a magic pill, but man, this seems pretty good. So I'm really curious, Darrick, what you make of some of these findings that touch so many different issue areas.
Yeah, so guaranteed income would be a pillar in a human rights economy, but I'm going to add caution. I'm going to say that there is no silver bullet policy, as you just literally stated, and we need to avoid the mindset of scarcity that pits various policies against each other. So I'm also a big proponent of baby bonds, which is literally a trust fund for everybody as a birthright. And similar to guaranteed income, everybody doesn't get the same amount because everybody's not born into the same circumstance. But the benefits of a trust fund should not be the exclusive domain of the wealthy. The ways in which the wealthy are able to facilitate the next generation in their family with a trust fund should be provided to all of us. So there's income, which provides some stream of resources, often used for immediate consumption, often used for immediate things that people have in their lives. But then there's wealth, which is a different concept, right? Wealth is a capital stock that allows you to get into an asset that is going to offer dividends in perpetuity, like a home, right? Like a debt-free college education to put you in a managerial position that offers the benefit of a pension. And I can go on and on and on, but wealth and income are different. We can add to the equation, in the 21st century, nobody who's sick should be thinking about finance when they're sick. At that point, they are completely vulnerable. So I think we need Medicare for all in the 21st century. That's another element of a human rights economy that is complementary to income, complementary to guaranteed income. But, it's not free health care because we pay for it as a society. But at that point when you're sick, that's the last time, that is the point where you should not have the stigma of finance nor the burden of finance. And the only way to get beyond that would be a system of guaranteed health insurance. You know what else I support? A federal job guarantee. A federal job guarantee. So, care work, well, we can finance that in a better public way. We currently finance care work through the public, right? Medicaid and Medicare are some of the biggest financiers of care work in America. Unfortunately, particularly through federalism, it's not financed with a dignity wage. It is almost a race to the bottom across states. But if we guaranteed jobs, we could do it, and we could include care work. We could include building our physical and human infrastructure in our country in a way that promotes not only the well-being of the recipient of the job, but our greater society in general. I mean, I'll be real quick on this too and say we're transitioning from gas cars to electric cars. So I know the Biden administration is going to invest in building up electric grids for our highway, or building up the ability for people to get electricity as they go along the interstate. Well, shouldn't that be owned by the public? Shouldn't that be something that if we're going to invest in, it becomes an asset for the country and not necessarily a private entity? In my mind, I think so. But that's just one example. And this is not unprecedented, right? The New Deal through the WPA and the CCC was huge investments, huge public investments that offered people jobs in a sustainable way. And those assets were retained by the public. And guess what? The private sector did very well in that period as well. So I think we need an economic bill of rights, or more precisely, an inclusive economic bill of rights. And one of its pillars needs to be guaranteed income, but healthcare, jobs, as well as wealth should also be accompanying in that package of investments for our economy.
So for the people under 40, that's Work Progress Administration and Civilian Conservation Corps. Google it. There was some cool stuff happening that we need to bring back again. Okay, y'all get ready with your questions. Be thinking about it. This is going to be my last question for Darrick before we go to the audience, and it's a big one. Let's talk about what I think has become it's the current tagline of the guaranteed income movement in this country, which is, it's wonderful that we've got these pilots, we now have evidence, but how do we go from pilots to policy? And I want to talk about, I said we'd get back to what is nationally the issue of the day. How would you describe the current political climate? Debt ceiling and all, lots of things churning in the economy right now. How would you describe the current political climate in terms of support for guaranteed income? And let's end on a positive note, if you can. Where do you see the opportunities, either at the federal, state, or local level, to push forward policies around guaranteed income?
Yeah, you're right. That is the right question, and it's also a deep question. Pilots to policy. I think we can come up with policies. I think the technical barriers to design things to promote a human rights economy, I've gotten a lot of credit recently for things like baby bonds. Jen was generous in her introduction by saying that I'm coming up with a good deal of policies. And people can critique the policies, but I don't think they're that genius. The policies are basically direct. If people are hungry, feed them. If people don't have capital to get into wealth building, provide the capital so that they can get into wealth building, right? So if people don't have health care, we'll provide health care. And again, this is not thinking about it in a charitable sense. This is thinking about it in a productive sense. I think of it as industrial policy. Care work is industrial policy. Guaranteed income is industrial policy, right? So I haven't answered the question yet, but I guess what I'm trying to point out is that the policies are not the barrier. We can come up with policies. So we need a movement. We need a social movement. And I tried to lead with pointing to building a human rights economy, because you know what we don't have? We don't have a North Star. We have an understanding of our society that I'm going to label neoliberal. We have an understanding in our society that firms are the mechanism and the engine of an economic dynamism that will lift all our boats up. And our concept of freedom is that get government out of the way and just let people choose. That's freedom, right? That is our understanding and a North Star of where we should be going. So it took a long time for us to get there. And there was, this is documented. I would recommend people look at Nancy McLean's book, Democracy in Chains. And I think there's other articles written about things like the Mount Pelerin Society, where learned people came together and were intentional in building a political movement to get us to the type of economy that we have today. So we need a social movement with a North Star, and we should say that North Star unapologetically. What kind of society do you want? Lead with that, build a social movement, and it might not happen tomorrow. It might take 30 years. But guess what? Commit to it because it's the right thing to do. But then we might get surprised. In this pandemic, prior to the pandemic, could you have fathomed that the IRS would have sent hundreds of billions of dollars to the American people just like that overnight? Well, that was an Overton moment that put us in a position to double down on a human rights economy. I'm really disturbed about this debt ceiling conversation and narrative, largely because of that, the narrative. Anytime you hear a deal and you think about compromise, whose interests get compromised? What were some things that came about from this debt ceiling negotiation? Well, we pulled back billions of dollars from the IRS. And what were those billions of dollars intended to do? Fight tax frauds, to go after some of the wealthy cheats. Well, that ammunition got pulled back. And then where did they seek additional revenue? Well, we're going to put work requirements for food stamps. So we're going to, something as basic as food, we're going to put a condition on it in order to claw back some resources. These two things happen simultaneously, or are happening simultaneously. So I think the solution lies in us building a movement and being unapologetic, being intentional, and not wavering from that movement. I'm not saying that compromise and deals won't happen, but commit to something. Commit to a vision. Commit to a North Star. I think that is what we need to do.
Whew, okay. We are going to come back to you, Darrick, but let's get some audience participation going. So let's go to some, I know you all are sitting there. I can see it on your faces. I see your wheels turning. So let's go to some audience questions.
I can't believe I said Alexander. That was terrible.
Got the first letter right.
Going in the Wayback Machine.
This is a minor question, but the National Highway Trust Fund came to mind when you were talking about public programs, not associated with the Depression, but certainly a support to the auto industry and to overall economic development. And it had to be national, it had to be governmental in order for us to have a highway system. I mean, there's just a lot of practical stuff here.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, right? And unfortunately, we've forgotten that history. So, there's nothing so new that we're saying up here, right? And indeed, we can cite historical figures that have come up with guaranteed income. The problem is, now here's the part that is new, we've done them in racist ways. We've done them in gender exclusive ways. So even from the political movement, part of the window by which what I'm labeling neoliberal was able to get us to where we were was to do it at the expense of black people by demonizing them as undeserving. So it becomes a more potent narrative that government is bad if you have government tilting the scales in favor of some undeserving group. So I think, and this is a hypothesis, that if we get to an iteration where we do it in a racially inclusive way, that mitigates the capabilities to dismantle it. If we promote shared values, then the ability to capture some political apparatus by pitting one group against the other becomes less capable in that scenario.
Darrick, are there examples of policies that do that you would lift up just to make that concrete currently? Do we have anything that you would say already has those characteristics?
Culturally at least, the two executive orders that the Biden administration implemented, which requires the federal government to measure and also commit to trying to be racially inclusive, that's at least, if not having more teeth in it, at least that's a change in culture. So, I applaud the Biden administration for doing that. Anything else? Let's see. When I think about baby bonds, I try to argue that that's a policy that has the elements included, and you know why? Okay, here's a better example. Affirmative action is on the chopping blocks. I hope it does not get dismantled in this iteration of the court, but given what the court has done, one might bet that they're going to end affirmative action. We shouldn't settle for that. But if that does occur, what do we do in its stead? Well, if we're going to use class as the indicator for a policy, at least use wealth over income, largely because of the ways in which Black people have been excluded from wealth historically in our country. So that could be a mechanism. I mean, we could think of others as well, but basically when you design the policy, you should design it in a way that intentionally captures the group that's been most marginalized. It can be universal, but make sure you design it with that intent in mind. And then one other point when we think about anti-racist policies, we know that our current political moment is such that there's some states that are hostile to various populations. So federalism, when we create policies that leave discretions at the state level, where even at a very local level, a place like Jackson, Mississippi, is constrained by the state government of Mississippi, well, we need to design policies that allow at least some federal oversight into anti-discrimination implementation of policy. So to me, that's the point. We need the intentionality when we design it.
Great. Okay, let's go to another question from the audience.
Good afternoon. My name is Gaston Arauz with Marymount University. I want to just highlight that I love when you talk about this topic, mentioning people that live in poverty instead of saying poor people. And one thing that I would like Dr. Hamilton to explain to me as an immigrant, now when you refer to middle income lifestyle, could you describe that to me so I can better understand that? Thank you.
Yeah. And other people could probably chime in on this. When I think of middle income lifestyle, I think of not having to borrow from Peter to pay Paul for a light bill. When I think of a middle income lifestyle, I think of the security to not worry about tomorrow in such a drastic way. I think of some security to be able to plan, some breathing room, some ability to have leisure, some ability to have agency in your life without the constant stress and pressure of how you're going to make ends meet today, yesterday, and tomorrow.
Darrick, maybe I can ask you a follow-up on that question because I think it was a good one. Would you, because I would, put another layer on it, which says, there's a geographic piece there, because what it costs in Arlington, Virginia to have a middle-income lifestyle might be very different than what it costs somewhere else. I think that's important for this audience. Do you agree, disagree?
No, absolutely. So, cost of living adjustments, and then localities should chip in. So in Arlington, for example, we know this is one of the more wealthy places in the whole country. So, Arlington should be doing more than Jackson, Mississippi to promote a human rights economy because they have greater capabilities, and that would adjust from some of the cost of living issues that might take place. But one other quick point, with these federal guarantees, if we get to that, when we get to that North Star, it has the aspect of being automatic stabilizing as well. So as a community in, say, West Virginia becomes destabilized as we technologically move away from coal to more sustainable forms of energy, well, you also have an effect, things like a guaranteed income. You could have an effect, things like a baby bonds program. So as those areas become more vulnerable to income destabilization, more federal resources will be going into them to promote new types of activity so that you have less geographical inequality across the nation anyway.
Great. Let's go to another question.
Thank you. How's it going? My name is Aaron. This conversation has been wonderful. I like all the points that's been going on, but it's something that I would like to ask you guys' opinions about, something I've been thinking about for a while before this, this meeting that we're having, this conversation. Guaranteed income, the human rights economy conversation that we're having. The component I'm missing now is credit, because it's not just a race thing or a gender thing, it's a class thing. If I don't have credit, we've all heard the note, bad credit is worse than having no credit, right? And then if I don't have the proper people in my life or the proper people with credit in my life, I can't get a co-writer. So I can have guaranteed income. I can have a job that's bringing me enough money to where I can go get a place, but if I don't have any credit, I'm not going to get the place. If I have availability and the skill to get a certain job, but I don't have transportation, I don't have the credit to get the car. So my question to you guys is, with what you're trying to do, with what's going on now, with what we're trying to push with this human rights economy and the guaranteed income process, how do we equate it with the missing credit part?
Yeah.
Great question. You want to take that, Darrick?
Sure, and then if you
And I'll chime in.
Okay. Right. Another thing to think about when you invoke credit is debt itself. And there's good credit and there's bad credit, as you pointed out. When I think about debt with something like, and I'll use the example of student loan debt. Student loan debt means something different for black people than it does white people in many dimensions. One, the economic returns to a college degree is lower for black people than it is white people. Households where the head typically graduated from college and that are black often have less wealth than households where the head dropped out of high school that are white. If we think about it in a wage dimension, it's also true that the returns to wages, the returns in the form of wages for a college degree of a white person is more than that of a black person. And when times become more scarce in an economic downturn, that difference becomes amplified. We also know that the vulnerability to debt is greater for a black person when it comes to college because of the racial wealth gap. So because you have lower wealth to begin with, you have to acquire more debt. So you have a scenario where, as a result of structure, the returns to this debt is less, and the need to take out more debt is more, right? That doesn't seem fair to me. So I just wanted to bring that up and say, even if we look at debt in an international context, as we moved away from more direct forms of oppressions of developing countries, we've saddled them with debt. And we use the guise of, well, it was a choice, and if they choose these bad decisions, then it's on them. But did they really have a choice? And the same thing with poor people. So if somebody goes out and get a payday loan, right, they know that's a bad deal. They know that it is extremely high interest and there's a high chance they're going to default on that. But if they have no income, if they have no job, they don't have a choice. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that debt has become weaponized in such a way that we saddle those that can least afford it with the most onerous terms. So we need a different society, and a human rights economy mitigates a lot of that vulnerability to debt. What else do I want to say on this really quick? Why do we need, for the things that you've mentioned, why would you necessarily need credit in the first place if we had this in place? So, historically, the GI Bill offered people returning from World War II grants to go to college, grants to have a down payment on a home, right? So we've done this in the past before. We also had, FHA loans, which facilitated access to credit at reasonable terms, not onerous terms, that also promoted home ownership. So if we have a human rights economy, I think it will do multiple things. One, it will offer credit at better terms than we currently offer it at. And then also offer resources directly without necessarily having the need for credit.
That's great, Darrick. I would add two very, very short, I'll make mine short, small points, and then I'm going to give you back the mic to close us out before we go to the final remarks of the day. I would say a couple things about credit. My goals maybe aren't as lofty as Darrick's, but really, really practical. One is the way credit scores are calculated. So there are like millions of people in this country who are renting, and they are like paying their rent every month to their landlord, and that's not counting. So we need some reforms in like how credit scores are even developed, and there's some innovation happening around that, right? People are doing that for decades, and it's not landing in their credit report. And then the other piece is, and I just learned this recently, there are all kinds of other laws that intersect with credit. So there are jurisdictions where how much you pay for your car insurance is impacted by your credit score, which is like ridiculous. What does how good a driver you are have to do with what kind of credit score you have? So I think there's some significant reforms, but even some small reforms that we could do that would make a difference. So Darrick, I'm gonna give it back to you for 2 minutes. 2 minutes or less. What do you want to leave the audience with today? If they just took away, because you said a lot, you've dropped a lot of brilliant knowledge, but if people just took away one or two key things that stayed with them, what would you want that to be?
So again, thinking about the debt thing, because we just talked about it, we don't want people in indentured debt. If we're going to offer credit, we want to offer credit in an empowering way, an enabling way, not a constraining way that limits their capabilities and beholds them to almost a modern day sharecropping. So the things to take away, we get to choose. So that to me is the big point. We can reimagine a world to actually achieve justice, to actually have a better society. The elements for us to fulfill that choice is commitment. The elements for us to fulfill that choice is to define that choice with clarity, and we can, and then commit to it. So the policies are not the obstacles. Our problems are as much political as they are economic. And one of the elements of why we aren't able to get this political coalition, it wouldn't be novel if I told you that race and politics are related. It wouldn't be novel if I told you that economics and race are related. But it is the fact that economics, politics, and identity group stratification, namely race, gender, that all three are interwoven and related. If we understand that, then we can build up a politics that does not pit us against each other into who's deserving and undeserving, and build up a political base so that we can achieve the economic policies to fulfill the vision where people really are free, where people really do have the resources to be engaged civically, to be engaged economically, and to promote greater equity. I think that is the bottom line, that is the solution.
So before I welcome our final speaker, please join me in thanking Darrick for his remarks. Okay. So now I have the honor of introducing and welcoming to the stage Arlington County Board Chair Christian Dorsey, who has a very exciting announcement to share.
Gosh, thank you, Nisha. Thank you. Everybody, let's give it up again for Nisha and Darrick. That was fantastic. So before I get to the big announcement, I can't help. I've got a microphone, so I'm going to say a few things. I hope that's okay with you all. But first of all, what an incredible crowd to be witness to this incredible conversation. And I'd like to thank the Arlington Community Foundation for not only bringing us to this moment, but for everything that has led up to this moment. The last time I was board chair in 2019, I was honored to shepherd our county's consideration of how to operationalize our commitment to equity as part of our county government with a priority focus on racial equity. But really at its core, what that was all about was looking at our local government to examine our systems and to ask some fundamental questions. Who's actually benefiting from these systems? Who's burdened by these systems? And can we take the institutional humility to look at reforming them towards building a government that is really focused on human rights and dignity? And as part of that year, I was invited to participate in the Shared Prosperity Roundtable from the Community Foundation. And as part of that work, they were crystal clear in wanting to make sure Arlington County recognized that there were people who were not captured in the overall aggregate data that tells us what a fabulous community that we live in, and that are incredibly vulnerable. And that if we're not careful, if we don't design and implement proper mitigants, the economic pressures, the change, the pace of development would make those people even more vulnerable. So we needed to do something about it. Now that wasn't just a convening then that they forgot. They followed through and developed a work program that addressed the issues of housing for the very low-income Arlingtonians, addressed issues such as childcare, incredibly expensive for everyone, essentially out of reach for people who are significantly low income. Even though we are in an area of extremely low unemployment, nonetheless, we have people who have needs when it comes to participating in the workforce through workforce development that are not really met by existing programs. And of course, this conversation about guaranteed income. So if you'll allow me, please join me in a round of applause for the Community Foundation for keeping us straight. Thank you. You know, this conversation was just so powerful. Thank you for this. And, you know, I jotted down a couple of thoughts as I was listening. You know, the whole notion of people who exist in a state of privation is really subject to a really funky narrative in this country. And it historically has been that there's something wrong with those people. They need to work harder. They need to become more educated, or they need to lift themselves up by their bootstraps. And that's a narrative, let's be frank. At one time or another, we've maybe all adopted that perspective to one degree or another. And this is not to lay guilt or blame on anyone, but just to put a couple of things into context in reality. In this country, or in this commonwealth that we live in, someone who works really hard, in fact, works 8 hours a day, 52 weeks out of the year with no break, is allowed to earn a wage of about $25,000 a year. It's the minimum wage in Virginia. Mind you, that's about 66% higher than the minimum wage federally. And don't worry, you don't have to do math. There is no math for this test, but I'll make it simple. 2 earners working full-time every hour of the week, every hour of every week of every week of every year is going to make about $50,000 combined. The median income for an individual in our county, Arlington, Darrick, is over $106,000 a year. So we've got a system that actually accepts that there can be people who devote all of their available working time to doing the right thing, working very, very hard, and nonetheless finding it virtually impossible to be able to exist in this community without help, without supports. We accept that. It's not a matter of their needing to work harder. It's a system that's not delivering what they need in order to be independently living and to have the agency and the dignity that Darrick and Nisha talked about. When we consider telling people to get more educated, just remember this exists in a system where the costs of said education, due to credit or other factors, may be on their reach, and also doesn't necessarily come with a guaranteed return on the other end in the form of a job, because we don't invest in things like apprenticeship programs which tell people your work and investment in yourself will be rewarded. So it's not a problem with them, it's a problem with us. And then when it comes to lifting yourself up by your bootstraps, I mean, you all well know, not everyone has a billionaire patron who's able to buy a house for their mother or take them on fancy trips or pay for their children to go to private school. Only a few of you picked up on the joke. But anyway, so it's not a matter of people needing to do more, it's about a system that's not really available to deliver to them. And so that is where this conversation comes in, recognizing that our system can be reformed to deliver outcomes that promote a human rights economy, because right now it's designed to deliver the outcomes that we are receiving, where people can nonetheless do the right things, but still be subject to a state of privation that they don't deserve. And so it's with that backdrop that my colleagues in the county board, and I'm pleased to have my colleague Matt DiFerranti here today, we are joining Counties for a Guaranteed Income to be a part of the national movement to uplift this, to actually break down the stigma that comes from providing support and the dignity that people deserve, and recognizing that there are policy solutions that are efficient and affordable that can actually deliver the outcomes of promoting a human rights economy. And so at our next board meeting, at our recess portion on the 13th of June, we will consider a resolution which will formalize our joining this movement, which will indicate our support of advocacy at the state and the federal level to make sure that we can bring sound, guaranteed income strategies so that we can address the issues that have been so thoughtfully discussed this afternoon. So I look forward to you all joining us and supporting us in that effort. We feel it is not only the right thing to do for Arlington, it's the right thing to do for our country, and we don't want to be a passive voice, but an active one in hopefully accelerating our chance to get there as a country. So with that, I would like to say again, Darrick Hamilton, Nisha Patel, thank you so much for bringing your incredible thought leadership to our community. And you all are invited to stay around. There are refreshments in the room, and you are invited to stay and commiserate among people who hopefully share this common vision. Thank you all very much.